Welcome to the program. I'm Julie Doyle. The Climate Change Authority has warned Australia will fall behind the rest of the world if it doesn't increase the 5% target to reduce emissions by 2020. Its draft report says the conditions are right to move to a target between 15 and 25% instead. And it says this could be done at a relatively low cost to the economy. The Environment Minister Greg Hunt says he'll take it on board, but won't be adjusting the targets at this stage.
We will make our judgment on the targets in the lead up to the 2015 conference at the end of 2015. We have a commitment to the current targets and we will assess any change in the context of what the world is doing, as we've always said we'd do in the lead up to the 2015 conference. So this is one input. It's a draft report. I respect and appreciate the contribution. Our time frame remains unchanged. The world will make a decision at the end of 2015 and we will do our analysis based on how the world is tracking at that point.
We're essentially going to end up with a rust bucket economy if we don't move as everybody else is.
That's the Greens leader Christine Milne there. The Australia Institute says the Climate Change Authority report shows the government will have to make changes to its direct action policy to meet tougher targets. As part of direct action, the coalition government will allocate money from a $3 billion fund for projects designed to cut emissions. Earlier, I spoke to senior economist with the Australia Institute, Matt Grudnoff. Matt, thanks for joining me on Capitol Hill.
Thanks for having me.
We'll start with the overall recommendation from the Climate Change Authority, which is that the unconditional target of 5% based on 2000 levels is not adequate. Now, they're talking about a higher target between 15 and 25%. Do you think that kind of target is achievable?
Definitely, it's definitely achievable. The modelling that was done showed that increasing the target to 15 or 25% wouldn't have that much effect on the economy. Indeed, by 2020, if we went to the 15% target, it would only take us 3 extra months to earn the money that we would have lost getting up to that point. So it's a very small amount of money in the scheme of things.
Now, the authority is saying that 15% should be the minimum. What's your view on that?
Well, 15% should definitely be the minimum. I mean, if we're talking about climate change and we want to solve a problem, then the people we should be talking to are climate scientists who can tell us how much we need to reduce emissions by. And climate scientists are talking about 25 or 40% by 2020. So talking to economists about how much we should reduce our emissions by is a little odd. We should really go to climate scientists, talk to them, and then come to economists and ask, well, how can we reduce this in the cheapest possible way?
Do you have a personal opinion, though, as someone who's obviously involved in the economics of this area, as to what you think the target should be?
Well, as I said, if climate scientists think it should be closer to 40%, then I think it should be closer to 40%. There's no point trying to solve a problem and not solve it. You know, if we want to avoid dangerous climate change, and that's our objective, then we should talk to the people who know how to avoid dangerous climate change.
Now, what about the economic impacts, though, of moving to a higher target? How severe would they be?
Very limited. As the carbon price showed, when the carbon price came in, most people didn't even notice that it had come in. It had minimal impact on the economy, and it was likely to continue to have minimal impact on the economy. And I think moving to a higher target, we'll see the same. It will begin to slowly bite, but I don't think it's anything that our first world economy can't handle.
The Australian Industry Group, for example, has put out a statement today saying that talking about deeper emissions targets is pie in the sky without an economically responsible plan to reach them. Now, they're correct, aren't they, in that this report doesn't actually set out a pathway to these targets?
No, that's true, but they did look at the cost of, say, a 15% emissions target rather than a 5% by 2020, and it was looking by 2020 at about $600 million a year. Now, $600 million isn't a lot of money. When you think the opposition, or sorry, the government is talking about spending $3 billion over the forward estimates, $600 million is not a large hit to the budget.
So do you think the impost on businesses wouldn't be that great then?
No, I don't think it'd be that great, but I think the point of a carbon price is to change the economy. It's to make them adapt. It's to make them less emissions intensive and less reliant on producing greenhouse gas emissions. So the idea is to change business. Essentially, a carbon price, or trying to get the economy to reduce emissions, is a way to avoid them having to pay that kind of price.
You've said today, though, that you see the answer isn't simply a carbon price or direct action action, the government's policy. You see it as a combination of both. How do you see that working?
Absolutely. So a carbon price is just one part of it, and direct action, or what the previous government called complementary measures, is just one part of it. There's a lot of debate at the moment where we should either have a carbon price or we should have direct action. That's a bit like saying, well, in order to fight smoking, we should either increase taxes or we should ban advertising or have plain packaging, but you can't have both. Of course you should have both. There are times when direct action is going to be able to reduce emissions in the best possible way, and there are other times when a carbon price is going to be the best way to reduce emissions. We should have both, not an either-or debate.
Do you think if it is only one or the other, then the result in reducing emissions won't be as great?
Absolutely. So direct action has the advantage of reducing emissions that the market doesn't necessarily reduce in an efficient way, but the advantage of a carbon price is it has the ability to scale up, that is to reduce emissions by large amounts, whereas direct action has a lot of difficulty reducing emissions by large amounts. A carbon price can do that.
Well, on that then, what changes do you think would be needed to the direct action policy if the current government is going to reach a higher target than 5%?
Well, if they would need to have a broader base carbon price in order to go above 5%. I think with direct action they're going to struggle to reach 5%. They may just reach it, but it's difficult to tell. But it'll be quite expensive. I think that if the government wanted to stick to direct action, then it's going to have to look at some large projects, things like a contracts for closure style issue where they pay brown coal power stations to shut down. They could also look at paying off the logging industry to stop them from logging. That's another way to reduce emissions. But they're going to have to be some very, very large projects. It's not just going to come about by a whole lot of little projects.
So more money than what the coalition government has allocated?
Oh, definitely. So a carbon price reduces emissions more cheaply. So if you want to go to a direct action model, then it's going to cost a lot more money.
Now, Greg Hunt has said today that he'll take on board these findings, he welcomes the input, but the government is not going to change its targets until around 2015 when it waits to see what the rest of the world is doing. What do you think of that approach? Is it sensible to wait and see what's happening internationally?
The longer we wait, the steeper the emissions cuts have got to be. And one thing that's definitely for sure is that if we want to reduce emissions quickly, it's going to be more expensive. So the better outcome is to reduce emissions slowly, but to do that we need to start now rather than later. So we can wait, absolutely, but what it will mean is it'll mean a bigger impact on the economy the longer we wait.
Do you see this though, there's a lot of politics involved in this one, and for the government to say, OK, we're going to have direct action and some kind of carbon price element would be very difficult politically for them? I
think at the moment the politics of it does make it very difficult, which is kind of strange. It's not really a political issue, it's a scientific issue, it's an environmental issue. And so I think the best thing to do is to try and remove as much politics from it as we possibly can and just get down to, well, what is the science telling us and what does the economics say is the cheapest way of achieving what the science is telling us we must do.
Matt Grudnoff, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you.
Joining me now to discuss the day is Labor MP Stephen Jones in Sydney and Liberal MP Dennis Jensen in Perth. Good afternoon to you both.
Good afternoon, Julie.
Hi, Julie.
Dennis.
Now we'll start, Dennis, with you on this one. To you firstly, why not take the advice of the Climate Change Authority on this and move more quickly to a tougher 2020 target?
Well, there are a few things against it, Julie. First of all, despite what the Climate Authority says, the rest of the world is not moving to take significant action on this. The United States, China and India clearly are not, and they're the world's
Well, the US has
major
set a
emitters.
higher target, though. We're talking about the target of 5%, and the US and the EU have both recently moved to higher targets.
Well, the ironic thing here is that the US is going to achieve it without actually having a specific carbon policy. The reason that the US can talk about this is because, of course, of the shale gas that they're using to replace a lot of coal generation. The simple fact is, for Australia, we've already got a lot of the low-hanging fruit in terms of renewable power generation and so on, and the other stuff becomes significantly more expensive. And some of the figures that I've seen the Climate Authority throw around in terms of reaching a 25% figure by 2020, in my view, are fanciful.
They say that it can be done at a relatively low cost to the economy. So you're saying you disagree with their figures there?
Yes, I do. I think that what they're looking at is the impact, the cost effectively of renewables when you're feeding it in directly in terms of what's called peak power load, where you can top off what you need. When you start needing to get significantly higher amounts of electricity generated from renewables, suddenly you're starting to talk about getting into the base load, where you've got added costs of things such as backup that you've got to take into consideration for when the wind's not blowing or the sun's not shining.
So even though this independent advisory body has said that the target of 5% by 2020 is not good enough and the conditions are right to move to a higher target, you disagreeing with that, disregarding that entirely?
It's not a matter of disregarding it entirely. I mean, I've had a look at what they've got. I'd like to see more detail in how they've come up with their figures. But what I'm saying is the 2.7 billion that they're talking about going from a figure of 15 to 25% in 2020, it's ridiculously low, quite frankly.
Stephen Jones, do you think the conditions are right to move to a tougher target? Would you like to see something from 15 to 25%?
Oh, look, I think we do need to have a plan for reducing carbon emissions to 2020 and beyond. We had, when we were in government, some pretty aggressive targets from 2020 to 2050. But can I make this point, Julie? The reason that Dennis won't give you a straight answer is he actually doesn't believe in human-induced climate change. He doesn't think we should be doing anything about it. So he's the Coalition's #1 denier. Why would you act on it if you don't believe in it?
Well, we'll get to
he's
that.
not alone.
We will
get
to that in a minute, Stephen. We will get to that one.
The reason that the Coalition won't accept the Climate Commission's advice is, they are sceptics on this, and they have no unified view on it. The direct action plan won't work. They know that they can't meet the existing target of reducing by 2020 by 5%. It's why their draft legislation removes the legislated cap. So they want to remove the legal requirement to meet the existing targets, and it's why they want to abolish the Climate Commission so they aren't embarrassed by scientific advice into the future.
Now, Labor's target, though, Stephen Jones, is 5% by 2020. Do you think it should be more?
Yeah, I think we need to have a plan to rapidly reduce our carbon emissions to 2020 and beyond. And when in government, we put such a plan. Well, the target should always be taking into account the advice of the scientists and the economists on this. But let's have a reality check, Julie. The real challenge for us in Australian politics at the moment is that we hang on to the steps that we've already put in place, when we know the coalition government, the Abbott-led government, are working as fast as they can to dismantle all of the programs that have been put in place, which give us a real chance of meeting the existing 5% target. So that's the real challenge, not whether we can extend it, but whether we'll even be able to meet the existing legislated targets of 5% by 2020.
Now, Dennis, I wanted to put to you the comments that Stephen Jones made there about your attitude towards climate change. Now, you have said before you think the effects of global warming are being overstated. Now, today, Bernie Fraser from the Climate Change Authority said in a media briefing that compared with other countries, we are struggling in Australia from a distinct lack of broad political consensus that global warming is real and raises serious concerns. Now, are you part of the problem, Dennis?
Well, it depends how you define the problem. First of all, I'd like to deal with Stephen's comment about the 5% target. Quite frankly, the Labor Party and their tax that they had on carbon dioxide were not going to reduce emissions. Our emissions were going to increase from around 580 million tonnes per annum to 630 million tonnes per annum. The sort of playing around with smoke and mirrors to get to a 5% figure had to do with purchasing so-called carbon credits overseas. And I mean, there's been a lot of shonkiness there. There's been a lot of corruption in the carbon credits area, and to suggest that we're not going to reach it when they were going to have a significant increase by their own figures, by Treasury figures, is a nonsense.
But what about your attitude, though? What about your personal beliefs about climate change?
Belief is the wrong word for a start. I mean, it's about data and evidence. And when you have a look at the data, there hasn't been any increase in global average temperature for the last decade and a half. This is something that the IPCC in their 5th assessment report accepts. The IPCC stepped back from projections of, worse storms, etc., etc. They've stepped right back from that. They've stepped back from the increases in temperature that they were projecting out to the year 2100. So the IPCC itself has become quite a bit less alarmist in their latest report than they were in their previous report, the 4th assessment.
Julie, there you have it in a nutshell. If you want to know why the Coalition have got a dodgy plan that won't work, it's because of people like Dennis who don't believe in the science. They're willing to say black is white and white is black.
It's not belief, Steve.
Nobody could read the IPCC's latest assessment report and come up with a conclusion like Dennis's. If they're willing to say black is white, they're willing to remove the 5% targets and put up a policy that won't work.
Now, Stephen, I wanted to actually pin you down on something too. Now, the Labor caucus hasn't had a discussion yet about how it will deal with the carbon tax repeal bills when Parliament resumes. How do you think Labor should vote on these?
Well, I believe that the policy that we took to the 2013 election is the right policy. That is to say that we'll abolish the carbon tax, we'll replace it with an emissions trading scheme. We'll do that because, unlike Dennis, we believe that we've got an obligation in this country to remove and reduce our carbon emissions, but we should do it in the most effective and the cheapest way possible to the Australian taxpayer.
Does that mean that
does
that mean that you'd vote in favour of removing the carbon tax then?
Well, I would vote in favour of implementing the policy that we took to the election, Julie. Now, I don't support the Coalition's legislation as it stands, and I don't believe that we should vote for it. I believe there are serious problems with removing the legislated cap, and there are serious problems with their so-called direct action slogan. It's not a plan, their direct action slogan. And I think the Labor Party should do everything within its power to ensure that as a government, as a country, we have a serious plan to reduce carbon emissions in the least cost way possible to the taxpayer.
Well, let's move on to another issue, still in the scientific field, and the Prime Minister's Science Prize will be handed over tonight to Terry Speed, a data analyst who studies cancer cells. But this government doesn't have a dedicated science minister. That's a concern for some of this year's winners.
We'll learn more about it as time goes on, won't we? When we see who handles science and how they handle science, and whether we are seriously disadvantaged by not having a science minister. But so we can just say at the moment, from the point of view of symbolism, it's not the most encouraging sign, but it's not the end of the world.
It is a somewhat surprising choice not to have a science minister in a country that, in fact, has a reputation internationally for its science performance. I mean, we are the quantum capital of the world. The kind of things we do, or things like the square kilometre array or the effort in photovoltaics research. There are many areas of scientific research in Australia that are beyond world class. It does seem odd that the government doesn't think of capitalising on this, but so we'll see how that goes.
It happens all the time in science. We've just lost the Premier's Science Award for primary school teachers. So, look, it'll come again, and science is not going to go away.
Dennis, you put your hand up to be Science Minister. Are you still hurting over that decision?
Well, Julie, the fact is science is being handled under two portfolios and two very capable ministers in Ian Macfarlane and in Christopher Pyne.
But is that as good as having one dedicated minister, though, having it split between the two portfolios?
Julie, I was going to say it's no secret that I'm of the view that there should be a clear science minister so that the chain of command, if you will, and the person that you actually deal with in a scientific sense is made very clear and very transparent. At the moment, the problem is, although all the issues relating to science will be dealt with as it would have been if there was a single science minister, the problem is the chains of command and communication are somewhat confused, and I think that does need to be sorted out.
So how do you sort that out, though, Dennis, with the portfolio being split between the two ministers?
Well, I mean, I remain of the view that we should have a science minister per se, where it's under one person. I mean, science is something obviously that spreads across all portfolios. Science is all pervasive, but you do need to have that clear line of communication for various scientists and so on. If they want to deal with the minister, they actually know who they need to deal with. I mean, some areas it's problematic. Do they deal with Minister McFarlane or do they deal with Minister Pyne?
Stephen, to you on this one, it's an issue where Labor hasn't been immune from criticism in the past, with the former chief scientist Penny Sackett quit halfway through her appointment. Do you think there does need to be a dedicated science minister, or it can be handled across two portfolios?
I think there needs to be a dedicated science minister. I'm very pleased that Bill Shorten has ensured that in shadow cabinet there is a science minister, but I will make this point. I think the coalition's position is entirely logical, in the sense that if there is no place for science in your policy determination, why should you have a science minister in cabinet? And they've rejected science in the area of climate change. They're abolishing the Climate Commission.
That is ridiculous.
So the Climate Change Commission, so they don't have to accept the advice of the experts in this area.
Well, they do
so
have two senior ministers there. Dennis, I'll get your response. Dennis, your response to that?
I mean, in terms of the Climate Commission, I mean, calling Tim Flannery a climate expert, quite frankly, is a joke.
Well, it's very well regarded.
Well,
he might be very well regarded.
What about Will Steffen?
And so is Al Gore. Well, the point is, Stephen, there are scientists that are somewhat more sceptical, should I say, on this area. Why don't we have
I'm sure they're on your mailing list,
climate commission? No, a climate commission that actually incorporates all of those views as well, rather than actually cherry-picking and only choosing a group of people that happen to agree with our pre-formed conclusion.
Well, back to this issue as far as what we're talking about, and that is having a dedicated science minister. We heard those pieces there from some of the winners from this year's science prizes talking about their concerns and their worries. Dennis, do you think this will be a decision that will be perhaps addressed in the future?
Well, I certainly hope so. I mean, something that's interesting is it's 50 years ago now that John F. Kennedy was killed. And round about that time, just before that, he put the grand goal of landing man on the moon before the decade, the 60s, were out. That was achieved, and it engendered a massive interest in science and mathematics and so on. We are now very much losing that, and it's something that we need to reinvigorate. And things like square kilometre array definitely help with that, but we need to have some ambitious goals.
Now, just briefly, finally today, a protest against university funding cuts has turned ugly in Melbourne this afternoon. Protesters burned effigies of Tony Abbott and Christopher Pyne and were involved in scuffles with the police. Now, Dennis, last time we saw the government embark on a commission of audit in the 90s, there were rallies around the country, and Joe Hockey has already said the government is prepared to make tough decisions this time around. Are you prepared for more of these kind of actions?
Julie, student protests is something that have always been around. I mean, I've been around in universities long enough to know that. The thing is, a commission of audit is extremely important. We need to know where we have waste, where we can actually afford to make cuts, because quite frankly, what we have in a budgetary sense at the moment is unsustainable, and we need to get that budget, the budgetary process, back under control.
Stephen Jones, what did you make of these protests? Do you think these scuffles with the police and throwing shoes at the police, do you think this is appropriate behaviour?
Oh, look, I can't condone anything that is an act of violence. I don't care who the political leader is or who the civic leader is. I can't condone anything that was an act of violence. I haven't seen footage, so I'm basing my comments on what I've heard just now, Julie, but look, I would make this point. I'd call on the government not to respond to these protests by trying to shut down voices of dissent, whether that's on university campuses or anywhere else around the country. We live in a free country. People should be free to protest. They should be able to keep that within the bounds of of acceptable behaviour, but I understand the concerns that students and others might have around the country about what the coalition is planning with its cuts agenda.
Well, Dennis, we haven't heard any discussion that you might be planning to silence any debate there.
No, I think that's a very, very long bow to draw. I mean, the only side that's actually been talking of censorship, and here we're talking about the internet, has actually been the Labor Party in the past.
Of course, your plans on student unionism, on student unionism go directly to this point, and it's an attempt to silence voices of dissent on university campuses around the country.
OK, I'm going to have to cut you both off there, I'm afraid. We're about to run out of time, as usual, getting fired up right at the end. Stephen Jones and Dennis Jensen, thank you both for joining me.
Good to be with you.
Thanks,
and that's
Julie.
Capitol Hill. We'll be back at the same time tomorrow.